First things first, when I say Marvel Rivals shouldn't be in esports, I mean it shouldn't be an esports first game. Basically, a title that heavily relies on the competitive nature at the highest level. Kind of like how Valorant, CSGO, and even Overwatch at one point in time did. There can be tournaments every now and then, but the companies in charge shouldn't go balls deep into it. And for Marvel Rivals specifically, esports shouldn't even be a top 3 priority for the game. Kind of like how Stardew Valley had a tournament at one time, but the whole game isn't developed around those competitions. You can have tournaments, just shouldn't be the primary focus of the game. And for my first point, I want to focus on the most important factor for an esports to succeed, which is the fans. I don't know about you guys, but a lot goes on with Marvel Rivals. It is a visual cluttered nightmare, similar to how Overwatch was too. That's just what happens when you copy a game bar for bar. You're gonna run into the similar problems. And honestly, I don't know how they could fix this. It's basically the very nature of the game for a lot of things to be going on. And it's impossible to capture everything at the same time. For example, take a look at this clip. Now, without rewatching it, how many of you guys noticed that this was only possible because it was a Loki diff? Basically, this player's Loki was smart and allowed for something like this to happen, while the enemy team's Loki was eating crayons. You might have noticed it if you rewatch it 1 or 2 times, but from a live POV, a lot of people are going to miss it. Even the commentators might miss it. I've been watching the esports side of it from time to time, and it's just hilarious like how crazy and chaotic things are. And don't get me wrong, sometimes that does happen in Valorant, but that's only because of ult usage. And you might see it like maybe 4 times at most on a map, because it takes a while to build up those ultimates. However, there are some things that I think the developers can do to improve the viewer perspective. One of which is you can add a mini map that can kind of help us see, oh, this player was flanking here. There was a major duel that the casters didn't really catch. And shoot, it might even help the casters point out something big that happens to the observers to pay attention to. I know these 2 things when it comes to in-game mechanics. Some Marvel Rival players don't think you need any mini-map or a health bar. I personally do, but at least from a viewer's perspective, I think it can help a little bit. Would it be enough to curb the overall negatives of watching a Marvel Rivals competitive match? I'm not entirely sure, but it wouldn't hurt to give it a shot. And don't get me wrong, when they were doing Twitch Rivals, it was fun watching certain streamers play the game from their POV, but when it comes to an esports environment, you're trying to capture everything. And at times you're just left confused as to what the heck just happened. Meaning that most of the people watching a Marvel Rivals esports match might not be able to follow it thoroughly, unlike other games like CSGO and Valorant, which are easier to watch. And another issue that Marvel Rivals is probably going to face is the GOATS meta that kind of plagued Overwatch. I do want to mention that I haven't seen a single Overwatch esports game. Everything I know about that game's esports, I know from the eScores YouTube channel. And from what I've seen, people really hated the GOATS meta. Basically 3 tanks, 3 supports. I feel like that's going to happen in Marvel Rivals eventually. And it's a really tricky problem to wrap your head around for a solution. If you nerf the supports and tanks too much, people are just going to be playing duelists a lot more than they are right now. But if you buff those 2 other categories too much, then you will get 3 tanks, 3 supports. And it will be a lot worse in Marvel Rivals than I think in Overwatch, because the tanks in Marvel Rivals can provide themselves a lot of sustain. And I believe one of the solutions to the whole GOATS meta was the introduction of role locking and role queue, right? Which is something that the developers of Marvel Rivals has already stated that they don't plan on adding role queue into the game. Maybe you can make an exception for the tier 1 esports level for there to be role queue or role locking, but at that point it's like players are playing a completely different game at the esports level versus like the casual rank ladder. And yes, you can introduce character bans, but with the way Marvel Rivals is growing, feel free to ban 3 tanks. There's just going to be 3 other busted tanks too. If you ban 3 supports, there are going to be 3 other supports that are pretty good. I feel like the GOATS meta is without a doubt inevitable for Marvel Rivals. It might not happen at the very beginning, but eventually I feel like it will. And seeing how I mentioned Stardew Valley earlier, this kind of leads me to my second point, fun. If this game becomes an esports first-minded title, it kind of goes against what the developers' mindset when it comes to creating new characters. I remember during like the alpha or beta of the game, the developers came out with an interview and saying that when it comes to character creation, they go with fun first and then balance later, which, you know, it's been working for them because the whole game is meant to be fun first, which is something that I feel like the Valorant developers should think about for future characters too. For example, Chamber was fun. For some people, he was annoying to play against, but ultimately he was fun to play, and he was nothing compared to how annoying Neon was. We didn't need esports players to tell us that Chamber was broken, but sometimes if something's broken, it can still be fun and low-key good for the game from a casual standpoint. For someone who was in the lower ranks of Valorant, Chamber really helped that ecosystem, at least for me, you know? Back in the day, and even till this point, people would just insta-log duelists all the time, meaning that other people would either fill or you go 5 duelists. Chamber was basically a duelist that was also a sentinel, so he kind of helped fill out a team in that standpoint. And since he was a pseudo duelist, he rewarded people with good aim. And there was a little bit of strategy when it came to his teleporter placements. He basically checked all the boxes that you would want for a character in attack FPS. The problem was that Chamber was too broken for too long and the developers didn't really know how to balance him. Everybody from Iron to Radiant were saying his problem was the TP, and the developers just ignored his TP for the longest. Basically what I'm saying here is that esports players can provide feedback, but aren't necessary to maintain the fun aspect of the game. For example, in Marvel Rivals, Hawkeye was nerfed not because of stats, but because of feel. If you look at Hawkeye's stats in terms of win rate, it wasn't anything mind-blowing, but the developers have listened to the community sentiment and nerfed them because he didn't feel fun to play against, and everyone praised him. But on the flip side, Valorant has lost a little bit of the enjoyability because the developers have listened to the pro players on certain things. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a push to like pressure Riot Games into releasing less characters, which is crazy to me. But the reason for that was because a lot of the Radiance and Immortal players did not like learning a new agent so often. And they were also worried that Valorant may turn into League or Rainbow Six Siege, where both those games have a lot of characters to learn. They were begging Riot to slow down with agent releases. And guess what? Riot bent the knee to the esports players and those high-ranking individuals. And now when we do get new agents, they're not busted like Chamber because Riot has been so scarred from the past that they're kind of scared to release a busted agent. And in most games, when you release a new character or item, developers make them broken on purpose because all that development time needs to be paid off by actually having players select that character. However, Valorant was kind of unique because why would you want to spend time learning a new character if you're comfortable with the current one that you're playing with, and all you really care about is ranking up? You'll just go back to your main after a week or two, unless that new character and or agent is meta defining. And again, to be meta defining, you either have to make that character so broken or make the other characters nerfed to push people to play it. At least that's typically how it goes. I remember when the developers nerfed Sova to the ground when Fade was released to entice people to play Fade more. Eventually they were able to rebalance both Sova and Fade where they're kind of sit evenly in terms of pick play. Another point that I want to mention is that if you start an esports game, you're giving pro players a lot of power over the direction of your game. I remember when doing research for past Valorant, it kind of hit me how significant it was for Sinatra to leave Overwatch for Valorant. It kind of marked the end for Overwatch and it brought in a lot of their viewers who just watched him into Valorant. But that was mainly because of how poorly Blizzard handled the Overwatch scene, with bad business deals for short-term profits that killed its long-term growth. However, there are other things that pro players can do that can negatively impact the growth of a game. Their opinions means a lot, which can be beneficial, but at times cause some setbacks too. And don't get me wrong, I think you should listen to pro players' advice when it comes to the competitive side of the game. For example, Fortnite did not do this for a long time. They introduced a lot of busted items and weapons like the sword and mechs that were in the game for way too long. And at one point in time, pro players just asked for a separate queue where these busted items were not in the game. It took them until 2024 before they listened and removed those busted items in their rank play. And guess what? All the competitive players loved it, and the casual players enjoyed this change too, because that means the sweaty sweats were more addicted to the rank play, and the casuals can enjoy their non-competitive game modes a bit more. Fortnite can do this because of the size and its premier game mode, which is one of the weaknesses of Marvel Rivals, which I'll get into later. But for an example of a pro player base that's very toxic to the game's development, we just have to look at Apex. I followed Apex for a couple of months, and it's kind of like in the pro players' DNAs to just trash talk the game. Like every pro player trash talks the game, but Apex Legends is a different level of hate. And I think a lot of people who criticize the games that they play need to embrace the whole like compliment sandwich narrative when it comes to giving out feedback. Basically, you start off with a compliment, then you move on to like the meat where it's like the criticism, and then you end with a compliment. Like people forget that positive criticism is just as important as negative criticism. Remind the developers of the good that they're doing so that they keep the good aspects of the game while they fix the negative ones that you may possibly find. But pro players trash talking the game is something that happens in every title. It even happened with Fortnite. Typically with Fortnite, it's always like competitive versus casual players' enjoyment, and Fortnite just basically separated the queues to satisfy both parties in that sense. And it's really funny because there has been Apex seasons that were actually legitimately good, but you still hear the majority of the pro players trash talk the game and its development. And then if you fast forward a couple years in the future, they're kind of nostalgic of the same season that they trash talked. It happens so often in Apex, and I'm sure in other games, but it's so much more apparent in Apex than any other game. And speaking of players, the game is just going to be very expensive. First of all, you got to worry about 6 players and a coaching staff on top of that. VCT, you see a lot of Valorant organizations say how hard it is to be profitable, and they only have to worry about 5 players. But one of the reasons why Valorant is successful is because the developers supplement the pro organizations with cash incentives if they do certain things in their partnership league. And I respect the Valorant developers because they're showing other titles that your esports endeavors can be beneficial if you invest correctly. And it's really ingenious because esports in general is seen as an advertisement for your game. So that's why certain companies are okay with losing money on their esports side. However, in Marvel Rivals case, they don't need an esports for an advertisement. The advertisement are the characters in their universe. I mentioned this so many times in the past, but Spider-Man by himself ratios whole gaming titles and franchises. And whenever a new Marvel movie comes out, they can just do a new character skin or something, or even release a new character. I remember when Fortnite was in the Avengers, I was like, wow, that's huge. Marvel Rivals can do the exact same thing, where they can put the game inside of one of their movies and TV shows as an advertisement. Shoot, they can even go one step further and make a Marvel Rivals TV show and or movie. In doing that, you probably get more of a return on investment. And if you didn't know, they have a web-based comic series. And it was a short but very fun read. And I'm kind of glad that they announced that they will keep doing the comic book series as well. It was truly an enjoyable read. I do admit that making a TV show and or movie is quite expensive. Probably more expensive than running a league. But this is Marvel and NetEase we're talking about. They got deep bags and can pull off something like this. We've seen it with Arcane where a lot of people were interested in the League of Legends universe, but a lot of people didn't play League of Legends because it's not friendly to new players. It kind of upsets me that Valorant hasn't made like a movie and or TV show yet, because I feel like if they put the same amount of effort that they did in Arcane but with Valorant's story, you will probably see a lot more growth to that game. Only time will tell if they ever do though. However, I don't want to be like all doom and gloom as an individual when it comes to esports. My whole channel mainly grew because of my coverage of Valorant. I also forgot to mention in my previous Marvel Rivals video that one of the things I respect about Marvel Rivals is that it kind of respects your time, right? The one thing I really dislike about Valorant and even Deadlock, the Valve game that's still in its like alpha/beta, is that they're so long. They're so long. I feel like any game where a single map takes longer than 30 minutes to complete, it's no longer a game. It becomes a second job. And Marvel Rivals, their game modes are pretty short. Same with their esports, where people can play a best of 5 in 2 hours. A best of 5 in Valorant is basically a good chunk of your day. I noticed when watching some of these matches, there were like multiple moments where I was like, oh wait, that was pretty cool what a certain player did, or how a team completely flanked another team using Doctor Strange's portal from the high ground, which is something that I didn't even think about doing. Plus, there's also the fact that we haven't seen the best Marvel Rival players actually go at it, like the best organized teams go at it yet. I've watched a number of shorts where content creators highlighted individual players just do genius things, like this Jeff clip where this player plans out the pathing for his ultimate, so he knows for a fact that he has enough HP and healing to get to his ideal destination of throwing an enemy player off the map. And there's another Jeff play where the guy kind of delays his ult to bait the other team into coming through this choke point, and he just gets them. It was really genius play. I was like, wow, that's really clever. And I really like those kind of clever moments that I see on my like shorts feed whenever I'm like accidentally getting a Marvel Rivals gameplay. And since it is a hero shooter, there are opportunities to see those like cool team up abilities where people combo their abilities to help others. For example, I think I saw a short where Wanda was able to pull off her ultimate thanks to a Magneto's bubble, which I was like, wow, that's ingenious. It reminded me of something that I actually did in game where I asked somebody who was playing Susan Storm to throw down a healing dome, and I would just enter it while ulted, and it kept me alive long enough to pull off my ult. I felt amazing doing that. So there is potentials for it to be good. I just think there's like a lot of visual clutter to get through that to really enjoy a full match of Marvel Rivals, right? I think Push the Payload, or what they call Conquest, is their best esports mode. There are certain maps that I've watched that I'm just not a big fan of, while other maps I think kind of work, like the Push the Payload map for Kanar and Yggdrasil's Path were like really enjoyable to watch, while other maps I wasn't a big fan of. And I also think there's a big issue with certain characters. The triple support, like I mentioned earlier in the video, is going to be a problem in this game. I know they nerfed it, but I can still see a future where 3 supports and 3 tanks are just the optimal team comp. You don't really need a duelist per se unless you nerf tanks further or supports further, and then run into the problem where you just find less people playing those roles in a normal match of Marvel Rivals if the developers end up doing something like that. It's really tricky to balance those 3 roles when you're trying to make like an enjoyable esports spectacle versus an enjoyable game for regulars just to play on their own casually. If Marvel Rivals wants to make a successful esports scene, I feel like it starts with the game mode that they need to create. A different game mode that would be more enjoyable for viewers to watch. That's the main thing in my opinion, because if people aren't going to watch it, then what's the point of doing it? And I think part of the reason why people aren't watching it is because Marvel Rivals is a very chaotic game that's really hard to follow. They need a different game mode that's a little bit easier and more pleasant for people to watch. What that game mode would be, I have no idea. But if they are able to figure it out, I wouldn't mind flipping my opinion on the whole idea that Marvel Rivals should not be an esports first title. I still think it's good for them to do tournaments here and there, but to compete with the likes of CSGO and Valorant in terms of esports enjoyability just doesn't seem like a smart thing to do in my opinion at this current point. But you guys let me know down below how you feel about the idea of Marvel Rivals being an esports first title. Or do you agree with me in the sense that they should just focus on fun first? Till then, stay safe, be a KDA warrior, and I'll see you later.